My speech is entitled Mass Incarceration in the U.S. America has long been called the land of the free. But are we really? Our population makes up 4% of the world population, but of almost 25% of the world's incarcerated people. That fact alone alludes to either a problem of criminals or a problem in our justice system itself. While of course both factors play a part, I want to look at the specific problems of our incarceration methods. Kalief Browder was one such victim of our country's so-called justice system. He was accused of stealing a backpack at 16 and spent the next 3 years in jail trying to prove his innocence. He was held in solitary confinement for almost 2 of these years, where he tried to end his own life on several occasions. His case was later thrown out. He never even went to trial, and he still had to suffer through solitary. When he did get out of prison, his family said he would hole up in his room for days, and later he committed suicide. This is just another example of the harm that is caused by solitary confinement and the injustice of our prison systems. In 2016, it was announced that well over 2 million people were in the United States prisons. That's more people than that are in some states. This number gives the United States the disagreeable distinction of having the highest incarceration rate in the world, second only to North Korea, which is a state that will imprison you and your children and your children's children for life if you speak out against their leader. Not only do we have high incarceration rates, but our arresting rates are unproportionately large. 41% of young adults and juveniles are arrested before they turn 23. And incarceration rates does not correlate with crime rise. In the last 40 years, incarceration rates have skyrocketed, a 500% increase, while the national crime rate has dropped. Though that statistic may seem to prove a promising outlook, that the method is working, that may not be true. According to many studies, no more than 25% of this crime reduction can be attributed to higher incarceration levels. In 2006, California did a reform of its parole and prison policies in an attempt to reduce prison costs and lower violent crime. In 6 years, the prison rate fell by 23%, and violent crime lowered a staggering 21%. Crime and punishment are complex problems, and sometimes doing what looks tough may not always be effective. Many people believe that all of this incarceration is because of the war on drugs and how it is unproportionately targeted minorities. With laws passed that longer minimum sentences and a throw away the key culture for criminals, we spend $80 billion each year on prisons alone. America has a massively unproportionate level of inmates in our country, and we are only beginning to realize the scope of this problem. Not only are there extremely large numbers of people living inside of our prisons, costing on average of $31,000 a year, living conditions and prisoner treatment aren't what they should be. Solitary confinement is an often used punishment given to those the guards don't want to deal with, which often includes the mentally ill or LGBT. This system is used on 80 to 100,000 people a year. Solitary confinement has devastating effects on prisoner mental health. International law considers it a form of torture, but the only regulators of the practice are prison officials. No judge, no jury. Besides the death sentence, this is the most devastating punishment we give out in this country. Yet there are no appeals process. Solitary leaves people alone for 23 hours out of the day in a room the size of a king-size bed. Because humans are social creatures, this prolonged lack of social contact can cause serious and permanent brain damage. People in solitary fall into depression, lose the ability to keep track of time, hallucinate, suffer from overt paranoia, and have panic attacks. The practice of solitary confinement was put out of use in 1890, when the U.S. Supreme Court stated people subjected to solitary became violently insane, and still others committed suicide. We brought this practice back in the 1930s, and its effects have been destroying minds ever since. Even a short time spent in solitary can have lasting negative impacts on your health. Remember Khalif Brown? Some prisoners are kept inside the cells for decades, then pushed back out into the world, usually in worse mental condition than when they arrived. Prison education systems have been systematically cut back in federal budgeting programs, reducing the prison college programs from 350 nationwide to only 12. 12! And getting into these programs are borderline impossible. The largest prison training program in the country has a waiting list of over 10,000 people. This is terrible, because the number one thing to help stop inmates from returning to jail or prison is education. It's proven. Once someone leaves prison, they have a 40% chance of returning in the next 3 years. Their life is tough. They are no longer available to apply for welfare, food stamps, public housing, and student loans. It is much harder to get a job with a committed felony, even though getting a job is often a requirement in their parole. What makes it even worse is that these people are often cut off from friend and family groups, so they often have a high rate of homelessness and suicide. There's no way around it. America treats those in and just out of prison like second-class humans. In the 1980s, during the war on drugs, prisons and jails were bursting. So, the government was approached by businessmen and were offered to use private prisons. The sales pitch was that these prisons, being run by the private sector, would cost less and be run more efficiently. Nearly 1/5 of the current federal prisoners are kept in these for-profit facilities. However, the sales pitch that they made was wrong. These private prisons cost just as much to operate and make the owners a ton of money. Last year, the Corrections Corporations of America, or the CCA, made a total of $1.7 billion. These prisons make money on keeping people inside their walls, so they do their best to keep them in. One study shows that these privately owned prisons deal out almost twice the amount of infraction as their federal counterparts. These infractions can lengthen prisoner time in jail, so it earns the company even more money. These prisons also sneak occupancy clauses into their contracts with their local state. This means if they do not get the minimum fill quota, the state has to pay them a hefty fine. Last year, a prison in Arizona didn't make its 97% fill quota, and the state had to pay them a fine of $3 million. Our country certainly has problems with our incarceration and justice system, with the amount of people we place behind bars, the way we treat them when they are in prison, and how we fail to rehabilitate them. Our recidivism rate is through the roof. The system has major flaws, but there are ways to mitigate the problems. We have to protest against the archaic and cruel use of solitary confinement in this age. We can try and lobby for rehabilitation and education reform, and even support those who want to try to erase the felony box for job applications, as to make an easier job for ex-cons to get employment across the United States. I encourage you to help lobby and for the rights of our prisoners and those out of jail, so they can have a second chance like they deserve. Thank you.